All right. Okay. Well, we have like 80 people registered, but obviously we're recording, so it's totally fine if folks don't come. Although if you don't come, you miss out on a discussion, which we want to make the majority of this study group discussion based. Conrad Hamilton is back to sort of co-teach this study group on the political unconscious with me. Welcome to Conrad. Welcome to all of you. This study group emerged through sort of a vote amongst the Discord Patreon of our Emancipations Study Collective. We've actually, we are also pursuing, if anyone is interested, a more intimate study of Kant avec Sade, or Kant with Sade, the famous, notoriously difficult essay by Jacques Lacan on the Marquis de Sade and Immanuel Kant. A very, very important essay, giving me and all of us, I think, a chance. There's only about 10 of us in this group. It's our Thursday night group. So we have a Tuesday Jameson group and then a Thursday group on Lacan. And so far, so good. Part of what my objective with the Lacan group, just as a quick background, is I've never really understood masochism, right? You have this very, I think, important series of texts on masochism, obviously from Freud on through Lacan, and even Deleuze wrote it, Coldness and Cruelty. And so there's this mystery about it. And there's also, I think, a question regarding the significance of the Marquis de Sade for the Republican tradition, political Republican tradition, which interests me a great deal. But he himself is an enigma to me. So, and I think also it frankly dovetails with a lot of the work that we do in trying to understand the position of libertarianism within the left more broadly, right? On that note, I will be interviewing uh, one of the great historians, Alan Wald. This is one of his books. He's written many books on the history of what he calls the literary left, or the bohemian left in the United States. And so I feel that this is a big conundrum when we look at French theory, the ludic, the Nietzschean, the sort of Dionysian element, and how that meshes with or doesn't mesh with the Marxist tradition. This is the heart of, I think, a intellectual problem that our group seeks to interrogate. That's part of what drives psychoanalysis and Marxism as well. So I will stick to the following format. We will basically do 45 pages a week. That seems pretty reasonable. Although this is a tough text, Jameson's Political Unconscious is a tough text. It's so tough that I've actually decided to do some PowerPoint slides for you. Uh, I apologize in advance. I don't really like doing slides, but I felt it's necessary when we get into the three forms of causality, to actually lay that stuff out, which fortunately is sort of a review from the text For Marx by Althusser that we've read last. And it's funny because this is like a perfect text for us to read following the Althusser intervention in some ways, because Terry Eagleton tried to argue that I think there's more Lukács as an influence in the political unconscious than there is Althusser, and I could not disagree more with that. I think this is a deeply Althusserian centered effort on Jameson's part. Why? I would say in general, Althusser is this mediating figure between a desire that Jameson has as a literary critic to retain some type of commitment to an interpretation of a text where we would derive meaning from that text, where we would have a commitment to an allegorical reading of a text, that interpretation is indeed possible. Because at that time you had a Nietzschean anti-interpretive tendency that was exemplified vis-a-vis Deleuze and Guattari, Baudrillard and Derrida, and to some extent Roland Barthes. And so in the first few pages, you'll notice that while he gives an homage to these thinkers as important, he does not wish to follow in their stead. And instead, what does Jameson say? Uh, well, he begins by saying always historicize is the moral of the text. It is the trans-historical and dialectical orientation of the text. And in essence, only Marxism can solve the riddle of historicism without miring the reader, the interpreter, right? He's writing this, I think, for the field of literary theory itself, right? But you could also, I think of the addressee of this text as the reader or any reader, the modern reader. Jameson famously says that his periodization of modernity is in line with the origin of capitalism. So it is Marxism. It is Marxism that Jameson says solves the problem of historicism, because Marxism describes the mystery of the past, even in situations which are foreign to it. Huh? So Marxism also, as a hermeneutic, because he is committed to something like a hermeneutic, and he even makes an interesting point, which is regardless of what the left Nietzschean anti-interpretive tendencies of French theory may be, he spends a decent amount of time reflecting on anti-Oedipus. It's clear that Deleuze and Guattari's text influences Jameson and that he is impressed by it. But he's not committed to it. He's tentative. He's definitely tentative about it. And I myself, as comrades know, are not only tentative, but at moments I feel that this is an evil effort. But that's a separate conversation. But also why Marxism? Because Marxism helps us penetrate into a hermeneutic of freedom. In other words, the riddle of class struggle hangs within any text and opens up the realm of freedom. So the realm of freedom is available upon a proper reading of a particular text. In other words, one distinction that bourgeois literature and bourgeois culture relies upon, the public-private distinction, Jameson says on page 19 that this is broken apart in Marxism. That Marxism helps us, you could even say, get at the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? In other words, Marxism reveals something. It brings something to the surface. He says that part of the aim of the political unconscious, he's working on this, I think, motif or imagery of depth and surface, right? Is to restore the surface of the text, right? Restore the surface of the text. And class struggle is what remains hidden inside of the text. So that's my understanding of how we read that idea. And I would even say that these first few pages, including the preface itself, represent a bold position, especially for 1981, in which the text was written, right at the moment, the dawn of the Thatcherite Reagan revolution, the neoliberal revolution, right? So not only is he sort of moving against the grain of French theory, I mean, it reminds me of Jeff Waite's book from a little bit later, Nietzsche's Corpse, right? In a certain sense, Jameson is not taking a polemical position against French theory as such, precisely because he's reliant so much on Althusser. But there is a fair amount of polemics actually going on here. Where the number one theoretical polemic emerges in the political unconscious is through a borrowed tripartite system of analysis that Jameson incorporates from Althusser's notions of three causalities from Reading Capital. And I want to articulate and sort of map or graph these for all of us. It's certainly the most dense part of this opening first chapter. I've had us read to page 35, but in reality, it makes more sense for us to read to about 37 to 39, where all of this is sort of concluded. There's obviously more to be said about the first 30 pages, but I want to jump in. And so let me share my screen. Okay, so this is very, I think, essential for us to grasp here in the sense that we have three forms of causality that Althusser articulates. And these forms of historical causality, because why is this so important? You'll notice that on the first few pages, Jameson makes the claim that what is missing in literary theory is what he says, a philosophy of history, right? And he invokes certain examples of philosophies of history, the Hegelian philosophy of history, the Spenglerian, right? This notion of cyclical theories of history. And part of what is happening here is a claim, again, because he's reading Althusser so closely, and Althusser I think he's really leaning on, there is an ambiguity, what we might call two interpretations of Hegel. There is a Stalinist interpretation of Hegel, which we can call a kind of mechanistic theory of historical causality, right? Which relies upon a kind of sense that structure, like a given structure, really, in certain sense, only requires a very crude dialectic in order to attain a sense of the inner essence or the inner truth of that structure. The best example of this, of course, is the base superstructure dichotomy, which I'll show a graph of in a moment. On the one hand, on the other hand, you also have a reference here to a kind of medieval Christian or Augustinian conception, which is a slight break from mechanistic theories of causality. And I followed the footnote on Jameson's discussion of medieval historicism, and it's from a thinker by the name of Henri Lubac. I don't know if we have any theologians in our meeting, but Henri Lubac is a very important figure who develops this sort of elaborate conception of historicism during the medieval period, Christian theology. And so one of the things immediately that becomes ambiguous is how one derives the distinction between mechanistic forms of historical causality and what he calls expressive forms of historical causality. Because in this second, in expressive forms of historical causality, it's here that the primary polemic of the entire text unravels, right? Importantly, and this I think is to Jameson's credit, what I notice here is that oftentimes a given thinker, let's say Lukács in his work Theory of the Novel, will possess both a mechanistic conception of causality as well as an expressive. You know? But what he doesn't possess in the case of Lukács is a structural conception. And the structural conception of causality is distinct to Althusser. We will examine that in a moment. So this idea of teleology is present both in mechanistic as well as in expressive forms of causality. In expressive forms of causality, you have the pinnacle of Jameson's particular reading of Hegel. I think obviously post-structuralist readings of Hegel certainly would dispute, I think, this reduction of Hegel merely to an expressive theory of structure. But it's also, let me note, this notion of expressive causality is also a bit ambiguous because you also have inexpressive causality, I would argue. What's a good example? I think a good example actually would be The Order of Things by Michel Foucault. I'm not sure how many comrades have actually read Foucault's Order of Things, but part of what the logic of an expressive account of history puts forward is the notion that a historical period can be reduced or defined by a particular constellation of thought, or by a particular master narrative, or by a particular concept. And I would argue that Foucault's conception of the episteme, right, In other words, as a sort of general um, governing series of limitations around the direction in which thought and creative thought is capable of going, strikes me a bit as a expressive form of causality, right? But again, Jameson will say, if we fast forward to some of his analyses later in the text to 19th century novelists, he will say things like, well, we still have to retain a mechanistic conception of causality, because how else could we explain for the transformation in the reading public once novels changed a particular mode of production and reduced the capacity of authors of novels to write in volumes, right? So you have the introduction, I forget exactly when in the 19th century, of a new particular form of novel that was highly condensed. So there's no way in which we can purely account for this in terms of some kind of absent cause. No, the cause is evident, right? So I don't want us to look at these three forms of causality and say that mechanistic and expressive are totally to be discarded. It's not exactly what he's saying. What he's really saying is that Althusser allows us to see within expressive causality, within forms of Hegelianism in particular, the way in which both the reader as well as the writer or the subject becomes interpolated in an ideological form, right? And one of the best, I think, examples, and I'm very happy that this example is put forward. It's a little bit later than what I had you all read. I think it's on page 37, 38, is Lucien Goldman. Lucien Goldman's book called The Hidden God is raised as an example of of a theory of expressive causality. I've talked a lot about this book, and I'm a huge champion of it. And Jameson, unsurprisingly, criticizes the hidden God. But what he shows is that it's one of the best examples of expressive causality done right. So what does this mean, expressive causality, in the case of the hidden God of Lucien Goldman? Well, if you're not familiar with the argument of the book, Lucien Goldman argues that a class worldview develops on behalf of the bourgeoisie that takes on a intentionally tragic epistemology for the purpose of relegating or sort of putting in place any revolution from below or any sort of revolutionary thought that would challenge the hegemony. And then Goldman then shows that within the field of aesthetics and theology, in the case of Racine and plays, famous French playwright, and in the case of Blaise Pascal, we can detect the inner essence of the worldview of the bourgeoisie through the production, through their texts. So their texts give us something like a unity between the subject and the object. It becomes knowable to us, right? And Jameson says that this notion, which he will later compare, and I think this is beautiful that he does this, he says that the central division between expressive and structural is between Althusser and Lukács, because Goldman was a Lukácsian. You know? And within the expressive, one way to understand that is that you do have a yearning for something like the unity of the subject and the object, or the identity of the subject and the object that is present. Whereas in Althusser's structural conception, that is only focus on the object. Okay? All right. So, as I said, expressive causality makes up the polemical core of the text, or at least at this stage of it. And Jameson makes an interesting point that one of the errors of expressive causality, right, is that he says that it makes diachrony into it sort of makes diachrony into synchrony. And as such, it inevitably cannot escape forming a kind of ideological object of investment of meaning from its analysis of texts. And therefore, it ultimately mires the reader into a kind of ideological reading of history. And as such, it's an inadequate form of historicism. Okay. Now, that's very abstract. I recognize what I'm saying is very abstract. But I think if we retain this general formula, we can then begin, as we read through the political unconscious and we see the wealth of examples of different novels and different pieces of text that are discussed throughout it, we can reapply some of these notions. On page 28, he says that the object of expressive causality ends up in a vast interpretive allegory in which a sequence of historical events are texts and artifacts, and they're rewritten in terms of a deeper, underlying, and more fundamental narrative, of a hidden master narrative. And this becomes the allegorical key or figural content of the first sequence of empirical materials. So, like in the case of the hidden God, right? It is the object of the worldview of the class which is expressed through the text itself. In other words, the claim is that there's a transitivity between the worldview of a class and the analysis of an exemplar of that class. In this case, a great aesthetic figure, right? So Jameson is very skeptical of this. Jameson is very skeptical of expressive causality, while at the same time, I mean, we should recognize what was one of his last books before his death on allegory and ideology. So he's not necessarily opposed to allegory. Now, allegory remains allegory for Marxists remains what's left of what Jameson calls vulgar Marxism. Allegory is not necessarily to be shunned. So let's say a couple of things about it, right? In some sense, allegory is some homage. It's some reference to teleology. It cannot escape teleology. And we know that we could say that the maxim of Althusser is that history is without telos and without subject. And that the strength of Althusser is therefore found in the capacity of Althusser to recognize a logic of history in the object of an analysis of a mode of production, which we'll get to in a moment, right? But again, Jameson is subtle enough not to fully abandon. I mean, it would actually be interesting to ask what this text would look like if he went full Althusserian. He doesn't want to do that. He still wants to retain a kind of skepticism to the allegorical, right? But he recognizes that the allegorical is inescapable, and that the allegorical, actually, oh, just 1 minute. Let me just finish this slide. Is inextricable with ideology. And so, in a certain sense, what we mean here refers to this idea that ideology, in a certain way, and again, keep this in mind, Jameson is talking about allegory and ideology and Althusser after his famous text on ideological interpolation, which we have not read as a group. And as such, one of the big ideas that emerges in Althusser's conception of the state, but also like the Marxist theory of modes of production, etc., is this idea that there is a semi-autonomous level, like the question of the levels of the various spheres of a given social formation. One of the big debates that's happening at the time of Jameson writing this text is whether Althusser levels out or relativizes the spheres of a given analysis of a social formation into a kind of perfunctory unity or like a false unity, right? Akshay, please jump in with a comment.
I'm so sorry. I mean, I didn't want to,
No, 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 no,
if you
please.
want to. I mean, but I guess, like, as you were saying, I was just like the way I read what we had read today was sort of like Jameson agrees with sort of Althusser's like structural causality and sort of like the critique of Hegel. But he's still, but like, I mean, I read it as a sort of, he's still trying to recuperate sort of a version of expressive totality, like not I mean, and that sort of seems to be like, the political unconscious, or that the absolute horizon of all interpretation is in some sense politics. And I guess, like, I mean, yeah, I had this like connected question kind of again, like, because, like, I mean, like, he says that because things are sort of inescapably social and historical, like things are political. And I mean, I sort of know what he means, but it's also interesting that, I mean, I guess like Althusser would say that, in the last instance, it's sort of like the economic or the, so I mean, what exactly is entailed by using the word sort of like politics specifically in that? I mean, so I don't know. So something that occurred to me tentatively was that this, I mean, again, like, and again, the difference from Althusser seems to be this idea of interpretation and sort of like a recuperation of some kind of hermeneutics.
Yeah.
And and I mean, I don't know, like, why say politics and not history or society? Or I mean, pointing to something about in interpretation itself, there's always like this
Mm-hmm.
Gnostic hidden dimension of like antagonism.
Yeah, I think that's very
Um,
right. That's very correct. Yeah, like
yeah.
I said, there's an
Anyway, sorry for
element.
the interruption.
No, 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 no. It's very helpful. We're gonna get to this in a moment. This notion um of the political as also something about a commitment to the real, which is a concept that returns and returns throughout the text quite a lot. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that this connection between um, expressive causality as reliant upon an allegorical form of objective interpretation, right? We can read as an ideological inadequacy, in essence. In other words, we can read it as limited. We can read it as partially valid in some cases. The examples that he draws from Lukács's theories of realism in the 19th century, and especially once we get to Balzac, will really elucidate this for us. But I think part of the question here is this idea of how does one escape the other trap, which is kind of like ultra presentism, which you have happening in like new criticism at the time and in a lot of cultural criticism, in which they don't even care for historicism. So, what he's trying to say is that even within Marxist historicism, you still get caught in ideology. So, he still wants to retain the rigor of Althusser's conception of ideology as this because like this idea of the worldview of Goldman, that there is something like a kind of transitive worldview of a class that appears within aesthetic objects of the members of that class. This would be reducible, I think, in Althusser's conception to an ideological imaginary, right? But look at this. So this is what is a portrayal which Jameson calls allegorical, by the way, of the classic mechanistic conception of base superstructure in Marxism. And the target here is a Stalinist reduction, which tends to privilege um, the economic, but privilege the economic to the exclusion of the cultural. And one of the things he says, I think, on page 36, right, is that one of the effects of Orthodox Marxism, and I mean, I would love for comrades to actually defend Orthodox Marxism here because this is putting Jameson perhaps in categories of post-Marxism. We can have that debate. Jameson's actually written quite a lot about post-Marxism. Um, is a refusal to undergo cultural revolution, right? So it's a kind of vulgar conception whereby you locate a static essence, which is a kind of vulgar allegory, but is thought um, from the standpoint of a mechanistic theory of causality, and is ultimately inadequate, right? It derives a kind of inadequate theory of transitivity. Okay. Now, he then gives us this graph, which I'm just taking directly from the text, to show what Althusser's alternative would be to mechanistic Marxism or to orthodox Marxism, which I found to be quite interesting, right? Um, and he says that in this portrayal of a mode of production, what we have is an eschewing of the two levels on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have this idea that um, there's a unitary object of production, right? And that the divisions are sort of semi-autonomous. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Jameson actually uh, recognizes, and I don't know if he gives a footnote for this, that there was actually quite a lot of Marxist pushback to the um, to this idea of Althusser's conception of the semi-autonomous levels of culture, ideology, the political, etc. Even though the economic functions in the last instance, Jameson still says that it functions as an absent cause, right? And I'll be very curious to see what Conrad says about this. Um, because in a certain way, there is this idea that um, there is a kind of postmodernism to Althusser in the sense that a given social formation is unified by the difference, not by the possible unity of a given element. So not one element is necessarily privileged, um, and so you then think of it as and Jameson says that this gives us a logic for an objective analysis of history. Okay, so keep that graph in mind. And then I'm just going to close with this point, which is a very rich point. It slightly exceeds the page that I had us read, but I feel like it's so essential just to like throw this out on the table, which is the question of mediation, right? The question of mediation within the field of expressive causality versus structural causality. Okay. What we get in Althusser as a Spinozist is not a theory of mediation between levels, but rather we get, or even this, like he says, like there's nothing, there's no Lukács, there's no Gramsci, there's no Hegel, there's no commitment to mediation at all. But then ultimately he wants to say that uh, we can still derive some type of theory of mediation in Althusser, but only as modes of homology, right? And this is very interesting to me. So he gives the example, for example, of like the family as a structure within a given capitalist social formation, in which not one aspect that mediates the family can necessarily serve as the site of, I don't know, like some kind of contradiction within it. That, like, there's a certain way in which, and I'm slightly unconvinced by this, but it all builds up to this kind of argument that Jameson makes on page 35, which I want to flag for you and which I think is absolutely essential, which kind of goes to Akshay's question about why the political. So let me read this here. Jameson says, basically, Uh, I want to. He's basically saying I want to make a kind of rapprochement with Althusser's homologous allegorical approach to structural causality. But he's not saying that he wants to retain Hegel, by the way. And he says, quote, history is not a text. It's not a narrative, master or otherwise, but it is an absent cause. It is inaccessible to us except in textual form, and that our approach to it and the real itself necessarily passes through its prior textualization, its narrativization in the political unconscious. Okay. Only one mode of production exists in Althusser, namely the synchronic system of social relations as a whole. This is the sense in which the structure is an absent cause, since it is nowhere empirically present as an element. It is not a part of the whole or one of the levels, but rather the entire system of relationships. Okay. All right. So those are some opening remarks. I've already taken a decent amount of time. Conrad, would you like to jump in and say some opening remarks as well? And then we'll immediately go to questions.
Okay. Yes, yeah. Hopefully, my internet connection is stabilized somewhat. I think maybe the solution to the problems associated with Zoom in China is connecting with my French SIM card. So hope that works.
You're good. You're good so
But
far.
good, good, good. Okay. But yeah. Thank you very much, Daniel, for those very rich, I think, remarks. And it's obvious you've put a lot of work into this. Um, you know. Maybe I'll begin speaking today by responding to something that was, brought up on Twitter, and somebody published a brief review of a book by William C. Dowling, which was a summary of the political unconscious, and it was published by Duke a couple of years after the political unconscious came out. And I think the book by Dowling is called something like Jameson, Althusser, Marx, right? Or the title, I believe. And it was a review of that book, and it was written by Terry Eagleton. And what Eagleton said was that he objected to the appearance of Althusser in the title of a book about the political unconscious, because, he said, why is Althusser there? Right? There's an array of different Marxist influences that are discussed in the political unconscious. It seems quite reductive somehow to suggest that Althusser is the decisive influence, right? And I have to say, I was a little bit surprised by that. And Terry Eagleton, in his brief review of Dowling's book, he does acknowledge that, in a sense, the political unconscious was the first major American work that dealt in an in-depth way with Althusser, right? Because it shows you the delay, in a sense, with the reception, right? Because Althusser, of course, was very big in France in 65, right? And this book's coming out in, I think it's 81, right? So that's like 15, 16 years. But, what I want to say is that, contra that opinion, Althusser is very important to this text. Um, but this doesn't mean that the text is dogmatically or simply Althusserian. If we can say that, Althusser is, in a sense, the uh, most important single Marxist theorist for this book, it's not because the book elects simply to, as it were, follow Althusser. It's because of the way that Jameson establishes um, an opposition, if you will, between Althusser's method on one side and on the other side, a dialectical method, which is assimilated to the category of expressive causality, right? So in a way, all these different Marxist thinkers, we could say Sartre, right? We could say, Lukács, right? And so on, Gramsci in his own way, they become representative of this expressive tendency, right? And, in a way, in this book, in fact, Jameson's going to try to mediate, between the Althusserian tradition, and between the dialectical tradition, because we know that Althusser rejects Hegel, and he rejects dialectics. But it's that very opposition that delegates a great deal of importance to Althusser because of the way that he's set up against almost everybody else, right, within this tradition. Um, Now, with respect to the moves that he makes in this text, I think Daniel's done a good job laying that out in the most essential sense. Jameson is, disputing different approaches. Of course, at the time he writes this, new criticism had been very popular within American literature for many years. So that's the idea of the text as a kind of self-subsistent entity, that we need to close read in order to glean the meaning of, right? The influence of post-structuralism was beginning to become very palpable, right, in the American Academy. Though it wouldn't be until a few years later with Stephen Jay Greenblatt that really congeals into what we call new historicism, right? So the idea that the a text has no privileged status vis-a-vis in its environment, and its meaning must be sought within this array of discourses that form a kind of epicene, right, of a given period. Um, what Jameson is going to do in this context is he's going to use Althusser's category of the absent cause, and he's going to insist on, and this is why the book is called The Political Unconscious, by the way. We have to ask ourselves that. What does that mean, right? What it means is that uh, history, right, is not representable, right? History is essentially non-representational, right? So there's no way that we can produce, as with many other objects, there's no way that we can produce a one-to-one understanding of what history is. So the only way, Jameson argues, that we can understand history is through some form of narrative representation, right? And he is, by the way, when Jameson says narrative, it's important to understand that he doesn't mean narrative in some, sort of reductive Aristotelian sense or anything like that. When he says narrative, that term is sort of expanded not only to encompass, non-traditional forms of narrative, but also to encompass, the various theoretical approaches employed by the social sciences, right? So, for example, Marxism, right, of course, is a kind of narrative, right, in the way that it traces the development of various modes of production throughout history. So you have a sort of foraging mode of production, right? And then you have a kind of antique mode of production, slave owning modes of production, feudal mode of production, and so on and so forth, right? And it's very interesting, and this is actually what I find maybe most fascinating with the text as a whole, right? Is that, again, if we go back to Althusser, right? And Althusser critiques what he calls in Reading Capital mechanistic causality, right? Which is, sort of like efficient causality. This causes that, right? And he also critiques, and he already had done this in Contradiction over Determination, though he gives it the name in Reading Capital of expressive causality, right? And expressive causality is the idea that, um, you know, the if a future is going to come about that was always already latent in the past, right? So you can imagine the kind of cocoon that's going to grow into the butterfly, right? That everything is already there, right, in terms of what it is going to become, right? So Althusser discusses this, right, in Contradiction over Determination, and he gives an example, right, from when he's discussing Hegel's historical studies, right? So the idea that Roman society was based on abstract legal personality, right? That abstract legal personality fails to encompass, the true breadth of human subjectivity, thereby giving rise to an emphatic principle of subjectivity, which is expressed in Christianity, and that eventually becomes decisive within the context of medieval society, which is obviously very dedicated or influenced or structured by Christianity, if you will, right? And so Althusser is comparing this to the sort of expressive narrative of, okay, capital and labor, these contradictions are going to simplify, right? Then there's going to be revolution, right? And again, you know, Althusser doesn't, or sorry, Jameson does not want to, um, you know, put too much stock, in some kind of teleological narration that is unilateral or inflexible. But what I find most fascinating here is what he argues is that, because we always need narratives to understand history, because history is non-representable. Um, and that in a way, the reason for this is because narratives aren't just narratives, right? This is like his essential argument, right? Narratives actually have a content, right, within reality that they can represent more or less effectively, right? So what now, and we see this, we could see this in any kind of book, for example. It's going to have a more or less acute or descriptive relationship to history or social reality in general, right? But the special privilege that he assigns Marxism in this context is that Jameson believes that Marxism, right, is the narrative that comes closest to adequately representing what is non-representable, which is the absent cause of history, right? And I think it's important to remember here some notes about this. One thing is that, Jameson often referred to his historical method as what he called absolute historicism, right? Now, why did he use the phrase absolute historicism to describe his method? Well, I think on one hand, the reasoning is obvious, which is basically that it's not just historicism in some kind of loose relativizing sense. It's, Jameson's view of historicism implies the necessity of Marxism, right, as a way of getting to the core, right, of this non-representational form of history. So it's not enough just to say history, right? It's not enough just to give a montage of attractions. Well, this happened and that happened, right? We have to talk about, modes of production, relations of production, social formations, right, in a more scientific register, in order to accomplish that. But, there's another thing that's subtle that we have to remember, which is that in spite of probably not engaging with him so much throughout his career, the term absolute historicism actually comes from Gramsci, right? And this term is used by Gramsci in the prison notebooks. And of course, it's no coincidence that Jameson recycles the phrase absolute historicism to describe his own historical method. So I'd like to read a quote here for you. I don't have a fancy graph like Daniel, but here's a quote from the prison notebooks. Gramsci says, "We must establish what is meant by regularity, law, automatism, and historical facts. It is not a question of discovering a metaphysical law of, quote, determinism, or even of establishing a, quote, general law of causality. It is a question of bringing out how in historical evolution, relatively permanent forces are constituted which operate with a certain regularity and automatism," right? So what is Gramsci doing right here, right? And what Gramsci's doing here is he's saying, look, Marxism is not, as in your sort of the teleological Marxism of the Second Internationalism or of Stalinism in a way that Althusser is reproaching. What Gramsci here is saying is that Marxism, it wouldn't be a question of imposing dogmatic or teleological conceptions of history. It would be a question of understanding that, capitalism does have an internal logic, right, to it. And that is part of reality, right? So if you look at, the world, right, if we look at the development of different nations, right, we can see how within a capitalist structure, you can see how under a given set of conditions, I'm not saying this is automatic, but under a given set of conditions, you can see how a nation, will go from, producing primary resources, right, maybe being relatively poor on that basis, notwithstanding exceptional primary resources like the Gulf and oil, for example, to ascending, in the global division of labor, to establishing industry and infrastructure, right, which are characteristically, linked, right, to, in the sort of neoliberal context of the most, quote, developed nations, right, we see the actual shedding of industry, right, which thereby becomes a kind of process whereby you try to cultivate a quote, educated or creative workforce, right, who then rely on the industrial labor of others, right, and companies sort of send out their designs. Okay, we're sending the design for an iPhone, you make it, and so on, right? So maybe it's a bit strained to go through those steps, but what I want to illustrate here is that it would be kind of grotesquely ideological or a sort of caricature of anti-dogmatism, if you will, to look at something like that and say, oh, that's just your imagination, right? You shouldn't use, you know, uh, teleological narratives to describe, what goes on within reality, because again, those aren't just narratives, right? They're part of our society. It doesn't mean that they're trans-historical, that they're permanent, right? That they can't change, right? But it does mean that, we can notice these forms of automatism or regularity in terms of how they function, right? And I want to draw attention to, because I noticed this time when I was reading through the text, which is that Jameson doesn't just, because the main gesture, because Althusser's main, um, you know, critique, if you will, is targeted at expressive causality, right? And in turn, the dialectic, right, or his conception of the dialectic, which of course you can argue is kind of a foil for, the productivism that had characterized kind of the Stalinian period. That's the main one, right? But Jameson also talks here about mechanistic causality, in the way that it's not just necessarily necessary to vindicate expressive causality in a sense and understand the way that expressive causality has a certain kind of purchase upon reality or arises from real indices. It's necessary to also understand the way that mechanistic causality, even within a larger structural kind of framework, will end up having um, more localized forms of importance. So, for example, like he doesn't deny completely the efficacy of, it's in a way it's important to what he does. He doesn't deny the efficacy of a kind of base superstructure model, right? Which for him is also a derivative of a kind of mechanistic causality in that way, right? So I hope that clarifies a little bit some of what he's doing fundamentally here in terms of the link with Althusser, and in terms of the non-representational status of history. But I want to draw attention to one other thing, which is that um, you know, maybe if you were trying to kind of locate the Achilles heel of this text in a way, I feel like probably the weakest aspect of this text is the way that his view of Marxism as being, the best narrative to understand history is largely declaratory, right? And this partly explains kind of his acknowledgement of, potentially polemical aspects of the text when he begins. I think at one point in the first few pages, he basically says, well, why am I not more concerned with laying out, a concrete criterion of validity to justify this? And his response is essentially that I don't believe that those kind of things matter ultimately. An idea is supplanted by another idea when a better idea comes along, right? It's not a matter of, justifying it in this very elaborate way. It's a matter of providing a more coherent understanding of how reality functions, right? So one could maybe, I don't know, I think one can construe that as a little bit of a cop out. Now I understand where it comes from because it is, again, in and of itself, very Althusserian, right? Because for Althusser, Althusser insulates himself from certain forms of critique through his assertion that Marxism is a science, right? Because remember that for Althusser, science is not something that can be rationally demonstrated, right? Science is a kind of alien language, right? We use, in order to, comprehend the fabric of reality. In a way, it's very resistant to the forms of logic and reasoning, which are characteristically the sort of domain of philosophy, right? So I think in a similar vein, um, Jameson here does not attempt to supply a kind of rationalistic or philosophical mode of justification for the privileging of Marxism as a historical method. But there is actually very interesting. There's an essay he wrote, and it was published a couple of years before this book, but I'm assuming it was written more or less concurrently. But it's called Marxism and Historicism, and it's published in 1979. And it's a little bit all over the place, as Jameson can be, as an essay, but it would be notable and I think good for people to check out in the sense that it does something that the political unconscious actually doesn't do, which is that it sets Marxism alongside other, forms of historicism, if you will. So the four kinds of um, differing forms of historicism that it's set alongside are uh, antiquarianism, existential historicism, structuralist typology, and anti-historicism. And the comments on these are relatively complex, but I will just try to give you a little taste. So antiquarianism refers to the idea that, um, you know, don't have to justify our relationship to history. Um, and in a way, or we don't have to justify the interest or the hold that history has upon us. Um, and in a way, this runs into a sort of paradox, I would say, because um, ultimately, Jameson attributes to it a kind of empiricism, right? Well, reality's just there, right? But empiricism itself, right, is like a very, very difficult kind of thing to defend in a certain way. And we could look here at someone like David Hume, right? We know that for David Hume, impressions are derived from his sensory experiences, or in a sense preferable to ideas, right? Which are susceptible to mislead us because they're devised solely by the mind. Um, Ideas, we can agree with them, we cannot, but they don't have a kind of concrete point of reference in that same way. But what's kind of funny about, this sort of empiricist criterion is that, it itself is a theoretical explanation. So the distinction between ideas and impressions itself derives from the mind, right? And therefore, all of the, empiricism in a way, it needs a philosophical defense that it's unwilling to provide, right? So this is the thing, even the supposition of reality as just there, right? Requires a theoretical defense, right? Because when you start to interrogate the kind of presuppositions that go into that, you're going to realize that they are actually theoretical presuppositions, right? So he makes this critique of antiquarianism that, the idea that, well, we needn't explain the interest history has for us, it's subject to a similar kind of problem. He also talks in this essay about he talks about existential historicism. And for him, existential historicism, I mean, it's linked often to Wilhelm Delphi, the Romantics, but it's the idea of, the past not as a kind of dry, fusty text, but a kind of revelation. And by the way, we could connect this to Nietzsche as well. So if we look at something like John Keats' poem, Ode to Grecian Urine, right, Romantic poet, he sort of discourses and debates on the images portrayed in a Greek urine. And this leads him to the conclusion at the end of the poem that beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know, right? Which is an homage to the power of appearance from the standpoint of the solitary observer. And we could kind of say the same thing about Nietzsche, right? He rejects a kind of meditative relationship to the past. Instead, it's a kind of manic exaltation, right? So the ecstatic dismembering of the gods and the Bacchic rituals, the enslavement of others by the Athenian Aristoi, the Greek religion of art, all of these for Nietzsche are kind of invitations to intervene upon the world, and to receive it in an active way, not just to have a kind of detached relationship to it. And he talks as well about, the way that this is borrowed in a sense by the post-structuralists who go even further, by dispensing altogether with the idea of a unified subject. I think Klossowski is discussed a little bit there. But one of the issues with this, right, is that this really, this approach, it doesn't have a developed relationship, right, to history, right, because it's stuck within this kind of framework of libidinal investment. Um, So what he shifts to from there is he talks about what he calls structuralist typology, right? And structuralist typology is, the deployment of um, structural categories, right? Which we can see in, leap, we see it kind of eliminate comes out of, comes out of, uh, linguistic structuralism. Before we see it in people like Claude Lévi-Strauss, right? The concept of the myth theme and so forth, right? But this is the idea that, you have to, um, you know, uh, you would have to, rather than viewing a culture in a kind of historical or evolutionary sense, that you have to look to the kind of constituent codes that inform it, right? And that these are going to, in a kind of presentary context, and that these are going to give you a rich understanding of how it works, right? So if we look at someone like Levi-Strauss, right? Um, when he examines sort of tribes, again, I come to this concept of the mytheme, right? This is linked to the phoneme, right? But much as Saussure, right, in linguistic structuralism, had talked about the basic units of language, right, to create his analysis of structural linguistics. For Levi-Strauss, he talks about the basic units of narrative composition, right, which he refers to as mythemes, right? So the idea that you have these kind of units of narrative, and then you got to put them together in different ways, right? And this is going to kind of give you like a more scientific analysis of how culture functions, right? And structuralist typology is, in a sense for Jameson, also, um, a more general term referring to an attempt to sort of provide a more scientific analytic of history in that way. Um, but for Jameson, um, and the idea of this, of course, there's like a Freudian dimension as well, right? And you see it with Levi-Strauss as well. This is the idea that by using these codes, you'll be able to find truths which are, quote, imperceptible at the surface of the text, right? Um, but the problem with this, in a way, and this is actually what gives way to post-structuralism eventually, um, is that this attempt to kind of separate out the abstract rules of a signifying system or the long of it from the expression of individuals or the parole. This difference, right? You have the rules of how a signifying system functions as opposed to the expressions of individuals, right? So traditionally there's a firm division between those in structuralism. But the problem itself is like, when you make this very division, right, you're already making an individual expression within structure, right? So Jameson describes structural typology as ending in a contradiction in which it portrays the logical paradox of a class that is a member of itself. And I think at another point, he's even harsher on this, right? He says that at its worst, right, structuralism would collapse into vulgarities, that make the Marxist base superstructure distinction, look extremely nuanced and subtle, right, by comparison. And the fourth one that Jameson moves here to is what he calls anti-historicism. And I won't dwell on this too much, but it's partly linked to Nietzsche as his existential historicism. But this is the idea that in a sense history doesn't exist, right? So whatever we experience, you can think of this is part of the analysis on the use and abuse of history for life by Nietzsche, though you could see it as juxtaposed in a way with existential historicism. But this is the idea that, history doesn't really exist, right? Whatever we're experiencing that is apparently historical, is in fact something we're receiving in the present and should be treated as such. And again, within Nietzsche, this is partly there, but, it's a little more complicated. But there is a clear example that Jameson gives, and that is the Althusserians, Barry Hindus and Paul Hirst. And actually, they take a step, because in Althusser we have this problem, right, between the diachronic and the synchronic. So Althusser had this very rich kind of synchronic analysis of the functioning of a mode of production. but he struggled to resolve the problem of transition or the problem of diachrony, right? So how does one mode of production transition into another? Etienne Balibar struggles with this problem in reading Capital and doesn't really reach a sufficient solution, mostly because the problem, it's just this problem you get to, right? Because, the structuralist analysis and the focus on presentism or synchrony, it ends up uh, blocking out or blotting out the actual sites of tension that would be needed to explain transition, right? To make a long story short. So it's a great, it's very useful in a way, in the sense that, it allows us, and I was even talking about this with, you know, uh, the the essay I wrote, The Social Formation of the Far Right, like how we'll talk about how, oh, Donald Trump wants to bring back the 50s, right? Like, as if, there's not a basis, for that kind of prejudice within the current functioning of the state, right? Or within the current functioning of capitalism. So it can be very useful, right, to keep that focus on the present. But again, you can see that the problem with that in a way when it comes to explaining historical change is that if you're just explaining everything by virtue of an appeal to the present, then you're depriving yourself of what you need to do that. So actually, the Althusarians, Barry Hindus and Paul Hurst. I love this, by the way. This is very, very gutsy. They say the study of history is not only scientifically but also politically valueless, and that all Marxist theory exists to make possible the analysis of the current situation. Right. So that's quite bold, right? Marxism, we know historical materialism, right? To say, well, history, the study of it's actually useless, right? It would only have a sort of functional value as regards the current situation. Um, and Jameson has little critiques, more or less developed, of all of these different, all of these different forms. But what he sort of argues is that, Marxism in a way represents a fusion of the best aspects of these, right? So antiquarianism isn't really addressed, right? But if we look at existential historicism, right? Marx talks about this, right? The history of the dead weighs like a nightmare upon the brains of the living, right? Within Marxism, like if we think about dead labor, right? Which is really what this is partly a reference to, right? The idea that when you work, right, your labor is being exploited, right? And then it's being invested, right, in creating this kind of capitalist closure, right? This kind of totalization, right? So you see this very clearly. To give you an example, right? If you look at areas that have undergone the process of industrialization, right? Places like Portugal or Ireland will often look very charming to us today because they haven't undergone that extensive process. Okay, now try New Jersey, right? So it's the exploitation of labor that makes possible that kind of transformation, right, of the actual terrain of reality itself, right, that comes to more and more resemble a kind of a functional platform for the reproduction of capital rather than a place that is really natural at all, or that can seem terribly inviting or attractive for us to live, right? So all of this is to say is that there's a sense of revelation, there's a sense of exaltation in the Marxist relationship to history, because we're recognizing the powerful ways in which class struggle, in which the exploitation of labor has contributed to shaping these very central aspects of our daily existence, right? There is also structural typology within Marxism in a sense, right? The present nature of the mode of production, right? These very, very elaborate systems of categories that Marx devises, right? In the belief that, something is needed more than our immediate experience of reality in order to understand it. And in a way, I think we can also understand that there's a certain kind of anti-historicism within Marxism as well, right? Because of course we're going to study history, right? Much as we're going to make predictions about the future, and yet we're doing it in order to enact political change in the present, right? So there's a kind of political instrumentality, right? That's very, very important to what Marxism is. So, again, this may not be totally satisfying as an explanation because Jameson doesn't have a kind of knockdown, causal argument, right, for why he sees Marxism as the best kind of system. But I think, again, touching on this again, part of, I think, what's so important to him is the fact that, Marxism, it, you have this debate within history, right? Jameson refers to it as debate between identity and difference, right? Do we exoticize history, at the risk of not being able to understand it at all, right? And we see this with Nietzsche a little bit, right? Nietzsche really takes this exoticizing approach to history. The Greeks were so different, right? We're just like epistemologically unable to understand it. And this becomes kind of a trope. You see it in Heidegger as well, right? Do we, uh, or do we side with the idea of identity and use our current categories to understand history at the risk of over-familiarizing it, of making it banal, of depriving it of what is different? And I think part of what's very special about Marxism to Jameson is the way that Marxism, again, it finds a kind of mediation of these dimensions. Because Marxism, right, the idea, right, that history is the history of class struggle, just written history, by the way, as Engels points out, because the foraging societies didn't have class struggles separated by material differences in the same way. But okay, written history, biblical history and beyond, the history of class struggle. The idea of, modes of production, right? These sorts of categories, Marxism, right? Marxism, it could only be created within capitalism, right? Because it's the economism of capitalism that makes thinking Marxism possible for the first time, right? But just because it could only be created within capitalism doesn't mean that it only applies to capitalism. Of course, some things, like if we're talking about, the law of value, right? Generalized commodity production. Okay, these are exclusive features of capitalism, right? But Marxism gives us a code for understanding everything that came before it. Now, let's not be too vulgar, right? Marx tells us, right? Peasants in the Middle Ages, they didn't, Marx says, well, there are limitations maybe to what a vulgar economistic model could tell us about, the Middle Ages. But then he adds, but at the same time, peasants in the Middle Ages, they didn't eat religion, right? So Marx kind of, he puts it a little bit equivocally, right? Yes, okay, maybe, we can't apply economism of my type in the same way to every mode of production in history. But at the same time, this idea that the most essential aspect of a society is how it reproduces itself materially, that is something we can apply in a much broader way, right? Acknowledging the differences between, the very natures of productions that are taken on themselves and so on, right? So again, Jameson sees the importance of Marxism in the way that it within a kind of, it represents a resolution to a kind of dialectic or a kind of structuralist combinatoire, right? And finds a kind of mediation, right, between these different approaches, right? Identity and difference between, existential historicism, structural typology, anti-historicism, and so on. It finds a very mature and developed mediation between those things. And I will just say finally, one last thing, and then I'm done. And I'll honestly take 2 seconds with this guy. I've gone on way too long. I want to say also that if we're trying to understand Jameson's rehabilitation of expressive causality, his belief in narrative, right? If we're trying to understand that, how does he not collapse into teleology when he rehabilitates narrative? Like, that's a good question, right? And I'm going to argue, though I don't know if he spells it out in a completely clear way here, but I'm going to argue that the way that he avoids it is because the key difference, I put this as simple as possible. The key difference, when Althusser talks about expressive causality, Althusser is talking about the idea of a linear narrative, right? The Hegelian dialectic could only go one way. Now, again, many people would dispute this as an interpretation of Hegel, but this is what Althusser is talking about, right? It's the idea that things are predestined, right? They can only go in one direction. And because Althusser rejects that, Althusser feels compelled to reject the idea that, the future is already lodged within the present altogether. He's like, no, it's not here. That's just kind of religion. Jameson believes that the future is lodged within the present, but Jameson believes that many futures are lodged within the present, right? Like, are we going to some kind of, I know, I don't want to get into a contentious alternative debate, but are we going into some kind of, neo-feudal, dreary, tech capital dominated future? Maybe that's something that's latent within the present. I don't think that would be too big a leap to suggest something like that is. We know this is a big object within dystopian fiction, Alien and so forth. Are we going into socialism, communism? There's a latency to that as well, and certainly in the 20th century. So there's not one thing, right? We can see the potential branching pathways, right? So I think in that way, I don't think he uses this terminology, but I would refer to Jameson's approach to this as a kind of multilinear expressive causality, right? To understand how he rehabilitates it. So I'm done. Sorry, I went on way too long, but
No,
there you
it's
go.
good. It's really Ernst Bloch, I think, too, that gives in later parts of the political unconscious, we'll see that Bloch's conception in the principle of hope, but also the notion of utopia itself as like pregnant forms of possible futures,
Yeah,
as a sort of lexicon by which we read different cultural forms and different texts. I mean, one of the things that I would like for us to think about, and for those sociologists amongst us, you know, we have a rich tradition, and Jameson wrestles with this, I think, throughout his career, of obviously socialist realism. I would love to hear what people like Druve and others would say about an Althusserian appraisal of realism, right? Because at first blush, realism would seem to be one more instantiation of expressive causality, and therefore kind of inadequate because, it's putting forward some kind of idea that the author is creating characters that are typologies of society, and there's a sort of subject, a teleological subject that's being posited. And that's another thing I want us to think about, which is what is the proletarian subject in a text like this, right? How is proletarian desire being read here? Because one of the things we know from, say, Lukács's theory of the novel is that class fractions are what is the depth. The depth of the text is an expression of an otherwise muted or otherwise disavowed class fraction, right? Whether that be bourgeois, whether it be middle class, whether it be petty bourgeois, etc. And so there is a certain fatalism of French theory regarding the legibility of class logics, whereby what I fear in this Spinozistic conception of a unitary mode of production and a overly generalized theory of class struggle is that what do we miss in regard to the legibility of class expression in our analysis of literary texts? Which, of course, I think Jameson will say just on page 40 through 50 that this is something that he wrestles with. And Connor will remember that when we did our study session on the destruction of reason, Jameson responded to Connor's invitation that he join us for that, which he was interested, but he said he was too tired to read the whole text because, as everyone knows, no one has read The Destruction of Reason except for us. I'm kidding, but not kidding at the same time. Well, no, he said actually the conditions, historical conditions that gave rise to fascism very much are returning to our present. And that makes the destruction of reason all the more relevant. So he's therefore torn because it's like, yeah, Adorno, who's a major influence on Jameson, hated this particular text, but you see Jameson is drawn to it and he sees the power of it. But so yeah, it's a very curious thing that he's doing here, and it's a certain subtlety of his reading that on the one hand, he wants to preserve aspects of that which he is polemicizing against, namely expressive causality. Um, and I think Conrad made some really interesting points that helped me a lot. I think one thing that we were less clear on is this idea of coding and transcoding, and how that. And I know this is to Philip's question, and then we'll go immediately to Andrew. How this idea of coding, like which is, this understanding, if we eschew a base superstructure model of thinking, uh, a privileging of a particular aspect of a social formation, say the economy, or we proceed on the basis of a kind of semi autonomous reading of different spheres of social formation. Um, what actually is the value of a transcoding or a coding form of analysis? I myself am not confident that that gives us what Jameson wants it to give us. Um, I think it's a very interesting way of understanding um, in a descriptive mode, but I'm not convinced that it actually is dialectical. And that actually goes to Philip's question about dialectics, which we can get to in a moment. But let's go to Andrew, and then we'll go to Philip's question.
Yeah, thank you guys both for this wonderful presentation. This was really really enlightening because this is like probably like the first Jameson text I've like actually like delved into like seriously. And so like, my first part of like my question or speculation is like how much does at least psychoanalysis inform this text specifically, and not necessarily like is Jameson a psychoanalytic thinker, but more like how he appropriates certain concepts of psychoanalytic theory from Lacan and Freud to understand, his Marxist interpretation of the text, specifically vis-a-vis not only the political unconscious, but something that Conrad brought up about, his notion of history or time and causality, contra the Althusserian linear one, where he mentioned something of like multiple futures within the present. And I can't help but think of repression as always a return of the repressed from the future, and how that ties in with this idea of history as not representational, not Vorstellung, right? But something that is like sort of inscribed narrativistically. But I'm thinking of it in like the terms of temporality along this movement of diachrony, because one of the things that I thought was really fascinating was this thing that you had mentioned, Daniel, that Jameson mentions about too much of the allegorical ideological, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah,
turns diachrony into synchrony, right?
right.
Um, right. And so I wonder if like the importance of diachrony,
Exactly. And that goes to the question of the subject.
yeah, in the subject, who's always, well, for psychoanalysis, it's an absent subject, an absent cause, a vanishing mediator, to use Jameson's point. And so like the second half is like regarding, I guess, like,
Well, that's part of the problem, right?
yeah,
Well, that's part of the problem. You could say that perhaps Jameson fully agrees with the inadequacy of forms of expressive causality because they produce a theory of the subject in a way that's too perfunctory or too easy. But then my question is, well, where is a theory of the subject in structural causality? Where actually do we arrive at a theory of the subject, or do we not? That's a question that I don't have the answer to, but please go on.
yeah. And like, I guess the last thing is like, I found interesting, like in I think it's like page 21 or 22, when he talks about, oh, yeah, 21 and 22, when he talks about anti-Oedipus. and like it's interesting thinking of like what our orientation, because the way I'm kind of like understanding this is like if he's this text is influenced by Althusser, it's like, well, if literature, aesthetics, and culture are part of the superstructure, ideologically as subjects we are sort of we have an imaginary relationship to texts and different interpretations. How ideological something like anti-Oedipus in the form of constant production, right? There in literature for Deleuze and Guattari were always minor literature, constant deterritorialization of the codes of the space. So you get people like Proust, you get people like Kafka. For them, they're always minor literature spaces in which they're not creating meaning or text per se, but always becoming molecular. So then the point is like we can never have a text to begin with because it's so molecular, and you end up becoming so metonymic and psychotic, right? But I think like for like someone like Jameson and like reorienting us towards like a sort of Marxist interpretation, it's like, what would history be like that isn't vulgar, Stalinist, teleology, nor caught in this sort of allegorical expression where we end up in like, the sort of Platonic or medieval sense of thinking about the text, but something that's like geared at the subject, but also geared at an imaginary relationship within the ideological superstructure via the text versus the social relation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. I love the pivot that he makes on page 22 through 24 from Deleuze and Guattari into an Althusserian mode, and he says that, and he gives a long quote from Althusser, reading Capital pages 186 through 189, where he introduces what I tried to graph as the three modes of causality. But again, what I struggle with is, while I understand the idea that a history without subject and without telos allows us to identify a certain radical objectivity of historical change and mutation on the one hand, but also helps us to understand um, this sort of paradoxical emergence of a series of effects for which the primary cause is not available to us, or something like that. Yet still, Marxism is essential because Marxism points to a horizon of principles, of concepts that govern over that Darstellung, that hidden abode of production, right? Which is why I think he's very much in line with this lineage of hermeneutics of suspicion, because he still is wanting to talk about how history has this logic that only Marxism can help us rhyme or put into harmony. But still, I'm here thinking of Badiou, who, as an Althusserian, is saying, yes, I'm going to write a book called Theory of the Subject, because that's what's missing in Althusser. Tume, welcome. I didn't know you were with us. Pleasure to have you. Jump in.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Peace, comrades. Hope folks are doing well. Interesting text for me to read. I'm not familiar with Jameson's text heavily, though I do know who he is. And I have not read all through there. I come to this text though in a particular different interest because I live in the world of the conservatory arts. So this is an interesting text, and Jameson has made interventions into film criticism that I was talking to a colleague actually in my cinema studies department of my school and asking how much play does Jameson actually still get, and he didn't seem to think that he got much in the program. But being a Marxist inside the conservatory arts is very interesting experience, and you get this because the conservatory arts has been ravaged by new criticism and French theory, to be perfectly honest with you, especially now. I think when the last past when I was a student, I would say going into the aughts, people like Foucault, Deleuze, they kind of run in many ways the philosophical bent and the people who then have come after them and been influenced by them. Um, so I found this text very provocative in a kind of challenge. Though I will say, and I'd be curious if Jameson has ever engaged with the 60s revolutionary radical artists like Third Cinema, who used dialectical materialism as their base. Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, Patricio Guzmán, the list goes on. I'm actually very curious about that. I looked in the notes. I don't think I saw any of those names. I'd be very curious to if he has in other texts. If someone can enlighten me that if he has engaged with that. Some things that I found very interesting. One thing he does challenge is this idea of the multiple meaning. And the multiple meaning has become very, 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 very prevalent in film studies. You get this kind of drive that everything can have a meaning, and you kind of push to that. And even in the creation, and you see this with film students who don't want to actually make statements or even pose questions with their art. They want to actually say, well, whatever you think it means. Right. And it's a very hard thing to encourage students to actually have. Now, what I found interesting of what Jameson did was talk about it having a patristic beginning. I thought that was great. Because I think about like my grandmother when she not my grandmother, my and actually my other grandmother. She would say this. My grandmother, my father's side was an atheist, though she never would admit it. My mother, or my grandmother, on my mother's side is not. She's very much a Christian woman, but she would always say that God is speaking through the text, right? And something that Jameson said really messed with me here, because if you take that, it makes the text something that is always living, right? So you're able to take the text and kind of reapply it to now, like the text is like a breathing thing, when that's not true. The text is situated within history. Yes, God, it can speak through, but it will speak through a locked perspective. And it's funny you mentioned presentism, Daniel. I literally wrote in my notes against presentism, and I put in a question mark there, because presentism is a conversation that we're constantly having within the conservatory arts about how we look at older pieces, right? This idea that we have to rescue older pieces from their limitations, so forth and so on. But this only becomes, I think, a necessity in a conservatory arts world that is not interested in class analysis, class struggle, right? And modes of production and how modes of production create art. It's completely absent from the conversation. So I found this text very, very, very provocative. I have tons of notes. I won't take too much time saying this, but another thing that he said, he brings in the rejection of the distinction of the political versus non-political text, which is great, something that I live by, right? But then something that I thought about is, I see this. There's a radical, I put in quotations, magazine that uses they say everything is political. And I have a lot of complications with this arts publication because I find their work to be very, very, very dodgy. So thinking about Jameson, it goes, yes, everything is political, but that becomes a meaningless statement if you do not have an analysis and a methodology of how you're going to approach thinking about the politics of it. But yeah, this is a very, very, very interesting text, and I look forward to reading it. But yeah, to my other questions, if anyone knows of Jameson's engagement, I'm curious with other radical Marxist forms of people who approach art and literary theory. I'd be very curious to know. Thank you.
Yeah, Matume, thank you for those comments. Really great. I'm not going to address in too much detail just the point about radical filmmaking because I don't know the answer. I did read through his two books of essays on cinema, right? But what is it? The geopolitical aesthetic, and I think there's another one. And they're sort of collected essays. And I know that Jameson was like a serial film goer, right? He would go by himself all the time. And I would be shocked if the things you're talking about didn't get mentioned at some point in the book, but I cannot remember amongst the principal major statements and essays of the books that was taken on as a primary thesis or topic. He does talk about some different things. He talks about 70s cinema and conspiracy as a response to the increasing difficulty of mapping our kind of world system. And he talks about, what they call, quote, world cinema, right, or non-Western cinema, as a kind of, allegory for the development of the nation state within a more global capitalist environment. But one thing that I thought, may be helpful to you, because you were talking about the absence of a standpoint with respect to modes of production. And when Jameson talks about how we should engage with text, one point that he makes really emphatically is that we should treat a text like an engagement with another mode of production, right? So it's not you, right, as an individual encountering the object, which is the text, without any suppositions, right? Like, oh, I'm just encountering this universality and it's going to change me, right? It's like you're actually encountering a whole different system within history, right? And I think that's really, really important to keep in mind. And this can, really lead us to interesting thoughts. I mean, I would tend to think, for example, that the reason that Shakespeare, obviously, formal, professional brilliance run amok, that goes without saying. But I think that part of the reason why Shakespeare has achieved this sort of monumental position within our culture has to do with the way that the relationship between historical identity and difference, because it strikes us as quite exotic in a way, the power of the poetry, honey-tongued Shakespeare, blah, blah, iambic pentameter, and so on. But at the same time, it's happening at the beginning of capitalism. So I feel like a lot of the things that he's describing are experiences that we still have the capacity to relate to on some level, or seem to resonate a great deal with us. So often they'll say, well, you can find within Shakespeare, proto-capitalist sentiments, proto-social, proto-Freudian, but I don't think that that's a coincidence, right? Because it's what Jameson says, like there is a latency, right, to the future within a given historical moment. I will add also, and I want to say as well, about your point about everything is political. This would be interesting to put in perspective here, because in a way, what Jameson would be kind of saying is, yes, everything is political, but right, there is, like this idea, right, the instances, right, the autonomy of the superstructure, right? You cannot skip the process of actually analyzing the structure, the internal structure of aesthetic works. But what becomes necessary and what's different from new criticism, for example, right? Or what's different than a lot of, structural analysis, right? Is that cannot be treated as something self-subsistent. So you have to show how that interacts with the larger canvas, right? Which is history, which he assigns Marxism a kind of privileged position with respect to its interpretation of. But there has to be a kind of localized autonomy that's taken seriously. So everything is political, but this is going to be very important to this, because a big part of his thing, we'll see this with Conrad and others, a big part of this book is arguing that, even novels that we take to be apolitical, right, are political, but they practice what he calls strategies of containment, right? So that they're, in a way, the political is repressed, political unconscious, right, within them themselves. But that doesn't mean it's not there, right? So everything is and isn't, in a sense, right?
Okay, excellent. Yeah, it's very good. There was a nice list of Jameson's favorite texts, favorite films, and favorite novels that I just shared. That Verso recently put out after he passed away recently. I just we'll go to Akshay in just one moment, but I mean I just am so struck by the operation that's happening on page 34 through 37 with the attempt, which I think gets to Philip's very difficult question about how Jameson sort of accuses Althusser of having an inadequate conception of epistemological break, where he tries to superimpose a new theory of levels, like an anti-Stalinist Althusserian conception of the various levels of a given social formation in the two graphs that are portrayed. I think, Philip, it would be useful to take a look at that. Quickly, we'll go to Akshay. Welcome, Akshay. Thank you for being here.
No, I mean, thank you, all. But I mean, I wanted to, I guess, hazard like an answer to this question of like, where is the subject here? And I guess like, and I think it's connected to all of this discussion that we've just been having in terms of both the presentism and the future and this absence of a standpoint. So I mean, so I think there is a standpoint, and I think that standpoint is the subject, and that there is interpretation, right? Like, and what I was thinking about, like, what struck me as very consonant with this idea of interpretation was something like Raymond Williams's idea of hegemony, but in particular, the idea that it's sort of like materially never totalizable, right? Because sort of being what it is, like an operation that is located in a particular place, in a particular time and place that's attempting to totalize, it never actually kind of successfully totalizes, right? Like, and like interpretation is this sightedness, right? Like in the sense that, and now, I mean, so there's this, I guess, like the Paul Ricoeur kind of like, where you take interpretation as your new ground and you're like, okay, the infinite text, etc. But I think he's arguing that Marxism does present a theory of interpretation, right, which is antagonism, right? Like in terms of, and I mean, I think it goes back to this question of like why politics and why not historical unconscious and economic unconscious sort of kind of in so much as, I mean, like the like what Mitume was also saying earlier, like I mean, yeah, these references to sort of like Gnostic hidden dimension, but hidden precisely because the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, and that it produces ideologies, right? Like religion as the opium of the people, and so on and so forth. But I mean, in that sense, like there is a standpoint. This is the standpoint of recognizing antagonism, i.e., class struggle, the necessity of freedom, right? Like kind of as Jameson refers to, like as this unitary story of all human history from which it is possible to claim this kind of. So again, like I don't think, I think he departs quite a bit from like Althusser's kind of defense in science, because he's arguing in interpretation a kind of priority of the political interpretation, just as an interpretation, right? You know what I mean? Like and I don't know, but that interpretation will never, because of the fact of class struggle, like kind of be able to kind of transparently circulate, right? Like that's um I don't know. So I mean, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but I think in that sense, like I think the fact that he's starting with interpretation, and that becomes kind of the basis of all of the following chapters. I don't know. I mean, it quite straightforwardly starts with mediation, right? Like in a sense that departs from Althusser quite a bit. I mean, and so
Yeah.
there's the subject.
No,
I
you're
totally,
right.
but
You're totally right. And I was going to say, and then we can go to Conrad. Just, right next week I mean, in a way, it's so beautiful that he contrasts the theory of totality in Althusser versus Lukács, because I think that that's the fucking heart of the question, right? About the subject, as I see it. So we'll get to that. And I would say, yeah, it might be useful for us. This idea of cognitive mapping and the loss of cognitive mapping is one of Jameson's most famous concepts. It's from a relatively short essay called Geopolitical Aesthetic. We may want to read it as supplement, in part just to sort of bounce it off of this 81 text we're looking at and see how it looks. Go ahead, Conrad, and then we'll go to Kolya.
yeah, well, I think when we're getting to this question about the subject, and totally agree, by the way, Akshay, but I think when we're getting this question, the subject, it's important to remember that in the preface, when he introduces this always historicize, right, which we didn't mention, but obviously very widely quoted. And I wrote a new article on this. Of course, it's also very widely misunderstood, I think, right? Because this is what happens when something graduates to the level of being a kind of quotable, because there's a lot of specificity to Jameson's kind of historical standpoint. But the first thing he says, and some pages later, he doubles into a kind of Hegelian inversion. But the first thing that he says is there are two ways when you approach history, and one is to approach it from the side of the object, and the other is to approach it from the side of the subject. And this text approaches it from the side of the subject, right? And what he means by that is like, it begins essentially with the question of interpretation, right? And how we understand the world, right? So in a way, he's already announcing a certain kind of difference with respect to Althusser's method. But I think along the lines of what you're saying, actually, this can tell us something, which is that, and I don't know if I'm reading a bit of Badiou into this in an odd way, but I think one could argue that if you were trying to parlay this into a more elaborated and systematic theory of subjectivity, you would argue that the subject arises at the interstices, right, of the um, localized context or sectorial context and its relationship to the larger canvas of history or unconscious of history, right? So in other words, like we're all living our lives, right? We're in these different historical contexts. We have different ideologies that pervade us, right? That are also strategies of containment, right? That give coherency to our social life and provide what ultimately is perhaps a necessary degree of distance, right? From history, as this sort of unconscious or sort of absolute in a sense in Jameson's work, and that subjectivity would be a consequence of how we negotiate that engagement, right? So if someone takes a certain position toward their, if they see themselves in a different way with respect to history, right? If they contextualize themselves in a different way with respect to history, if they contextualize themselves in a different way with respect to their world, right? That there's a subjectivity which is emergent within that, right? That is being manifested, right? And interpretation here is obviously not just like you're sitting here reading a book, right? It has to do with the fundamental way that you practically position yourself within the world, right? Because this is part of the thing, right? For Jameson, as with, in this kind of structuralist come post-structuralist perspective, we're always kind of reading text in a way as well, right? Even if history is not a text, right?
Yeah, he does mention something about the interpolation of subjectivity vis-a-vis reading, and that's something that he gets from Althusser. So that tracks. Conrad, thank you very much. Let's hear from Kolya. Welcome.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so also following up on this question of the subject, my friend has this nice point about the Bob Dylan song, A Simple Twist of Fate, where he basically says the song illustrates the ultimate kind of real, which is the cruelty of fate. And the narrator of the song is this subject who's a pure subject of contingency. And the trauma here is that like one thing happens, and the cause is absent, which is kind of what we've been getting at. And so there's these ideological ideas of causality, which I guess Jameson points out kind of show up in some of even the Marxist conceptions of causality. And then there's this Marxist mechanism, which even if it's useful in some instances, also kind of represses this this ultimate real of contingency, the absent cause. And I think this is kind of the trauma of the 20th century for Marxists, which is that this Marxist mechanism doesn't really come to the rescue, doesn't prepare the subject to act within this contingency of fate in the conjuncture. And of course, to follow up on what Mtume said, neither does the question like, what do you think it means? This totally open postmodern interpretive act. And it's probably become clear by now that I'm always looking for hegemony in any of the things we read, and in questions of subjectivity. And I think that to ask the question, where is the subject? I think one way to think about this is that we're subjects castrated by history's contingency. And this puts us in a position to make kind of an impossible choice, but a free choice. And yes, actually, I think an interpretation, but also a bet on one of what Conrad referred to as these multilinear causalities or latent futures within a conjuncture. And I think in the last series on Althusser, Daniel asked a good question. He was like, well, where, doesn't some of this conjunctural privileging fall into relativism in some cases? And that is a danger. But I think it's this interpretive wager, which does rely on Marxism. It retains a faith in the Marxist principles in capital. And at the same time, recognizes these multilinear causalities within the conjuncture and makes a bet, takes a risk on one of these things. And I think that right now, we do suffer from a refusal to make an intervention in what Lasserre calls a linguistic conjuncture. We refuse the need to have a slogan. I think this is one of the biggest symptoms of contemporary Marxism's refusal of the problem of contingency. Fight the right, build the left. That's not a slogan. Things like this we see everywhere in contemporary Marxism. And so, yeah, I wanted to leave it with this challenge, basically, of how do we intervene in a linguistic conjuncture.
Brilliant.
By the way, and just to say about that, I want to say, beautiful song, by the way, Simple Twist of Fate, for those who don't know it. But one of the amazing things about that song, in relation to what you're saying, is it doesn't follow this, cliche according to which, after you lose someone, okay, well, it was also contingent, I feel the sense of loss, and so on. The sense of loss and the contingency is already there at the beginning of the love affair, right? What does he say? He says they walked something down by an old motel. Um, you know, uh, he felt the heat of the night hit him like a freight train, right? And I guess the implication is this is when they're first gonna have sex, right? I guess that's the idea. But the point is that he realizes he's becoming a subject, as it were, in this very moment because of the intervention of this contingency, and the possibility of the loss is already apparent from the very beginning because it's scary to begin to transform yourself, right? And it's scary when in a very, again, a little bit Badian sense, it's scary when you develop a relationship with another person, right? And then so the loss is for the loss of that subject formation, right? After the fact. And yet on some level, right, the narrator always knew that it was something that by virtue of attaching himself to, he could lose, by virtue of the transformation that was being enacted, could be lost, right? So I think that's the powerful complexity of the work on that level. But I just wanted to add that. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. No, you really made me think of like the poet Mallarmé and this idea of uh, chance and contingency and but I think also I very much resonate with what you say about because there's a really funny thing of you read a lot of Jameson, you notice that he starts to sound like a orthodox Marxist all the time, and then he doesn't. And so I think embedded within Jameson's desire is those three modes of causality that I laid out, right? Again, it's he wants to think of them as like spinning plates. He's not like he's a very sophisticated Marxist, but he's also like I think he was I think his like praxis is like council communism, if I'm not mistaken. So he has I mean that would actually be interesting for somebody to do some research on what type of sectarian affiliations Frederick Jameson was affiliated with, other than that wonderful little anecdote of Philip K. Dick reporting Jameson when he was a grad student to the FBI. You guys know that story? Anyways, John, please.
Can you hear me? You guys hear me?
We can.
Okay. All right. So I have it's getting late and I don't want to belabor the conversation, so I'm gonna jettison a lot of my comments here. But there was one thing that I think for me was important, and that was something you said earlier, Daniel, about Marx giving us access to the concept of freedom. That seems to be wrapped up in this concept of subjectivity. So, two questions. One is, could you define for me the concept of freedom? And then related to subjectivity, again, not to belabor the point too much, but are we asserting a kind of universal subjectivity, or are we uh, sort of, are we okay assuming a kind of Lippmann-esque uh, hidden public or non-existent public? So those are my two questions.
Yeah, Jameson is referencing a quote directly from Marx's Capital regarding a teleological interpretation of the dissolution of the capitalist world system into the realm of necessity. So this Hegelian idea, which is utopian. And Jameson retains a Blockian commitment to utopia throughout this text, and we'll see a lot of references to that. And leaves open, yeah, I would say leaves open something like that premise, that principle, as viable, but moreover, that encoded within texts is a another form of freedom, which is repressed and which is expressive in characters who are blocked from participation in that form of freedom that they desire.
What I'm asking is this: the concept here of freedom, is this a universal concept? And define for me, what does this mean? I hear, in discussions like this, and in in sort of Marxist discourse, I hear a lot this idea of freedom, which is discussed but never defined. And as someone who approaches this literature from a non-Marxist intellectual background, I need someone to tell me, to define for me this concept of freedom, because it seems as though this is sort of part and parcel to to subjectivity, to ideas of subjectivity and the universality of subjectivity, and whether or not, we can get away from or jettison a kind of teleological approach. So that's what I'm
Yeah,
asking. What is freedom? I mean, in
right.
other words, what is this? What is this thing called freedom?
I mean, I think it's working with the Hegelian idea of the system of ethical life, that kind of appendage to phenomenology of spirit, or even the Kantian kingdom of ends. So it's coming out of a German idealist conception of freedom qua within the realm of citizenship. That something like that is finitely possible. The Marxist vision, in a classical sense, in an orthodox sense, would have it that is a constrained freedom, because capitalism imposes systems of domination and exploitation. So freedom therefore necessitates a revolutionary rupture with the capitalist system, and that is unthought in both Hegel and Kant. But that doesn't mean that Hegel and Kant's conceptions of a form of social life in which human freedom is possible in non-instrumentalized, non-domination forms. Of course, that's on the horizon. Capitalism is self-dissolving in that way, and the proletariat is also, like the old mole, bringing that about. Right, those two processes are happening. It's kind of like the Janus face of the capitalist system. It's being overwrought by its own contradictions, and it's being overcome by the proletariat itself.
So we're talking about a universal subjectivity.
Yeah, I think so. 100%.
Could I just add to, on
Please.
page 19, there's a footnote. And like, I mean, if you read the footnote, it's basically, it's not a universal subjectivity, but it is a universal subjectivity. And I mean, in the sense that what's universal is that subjectivity is structured by a mode of production. And like, that is universal. But on the other hand, we don't know if So, for example, like Marx will critique someone like Robinson Crusoe who goes like, a person lands up in an island and behaves like an entrepreneur, right? Like, because that sort of thinks the individual is a transhistorical phenomenon and doesn't think about how do individuals rise out of a particular mode of production. But on the other hand, you don't want to exoticize history to such an extent that you're like, oh, yes, the savages, they had their weird religions. We don't know why they worked, how they worked. He's like, no, that too can be explained by class struggle. They too have a subjectivity that's entirely understandable, but we need to historicize absolutely and insist on the radical difference. And then, so there's this kind of like Gnostic interlude through which you have to go through. But what you arrive at is like this expanded universality, right? Like which has both difference, but kind of the identity of those differences.
I think it's good here to remember also, and if you, whatever stock you put in this, but in Catron's book, right, he talks about having Jameson
which
attending a
Catron book?
talk, the smaller one, the first one. What is it? That was
The
published by
the
Sublation.
sublation one. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
okay, the death of the
yeah,
American left and yada yada. Yeah,
yeah. So in that he talks about having attended a lecture by Jameson and asked him a question about freedom. And I guess Jameson, this is possibly a little bit polemical or a bit of an annoyed response, but he responded that, quote, freedom is a right-wing concept. So, and I don't think that here that what he means is that freedom is valueless or anything like that. But I think along the lines of what Daniel was saying, maybe I would put the accent a bit more on the relationality. But it's the idea that, it has to arise on the basis of, collective ethical life, the mediation with historical structures, and that freedom posited as an absolute without these significant qualifications would collapse into a kind of right-wing vertigo, right? Which I do think is consistent with his thought on that level. So
Yeah, I think
yeah,
it's also in this reference, at least to capital, this notion of realm of freedom as autonomous labor of us, the realm of associative producers
sure.
is the panacea that is on offer. Um, then you could get into certain debates about the way that the capitalist system, like somebody was mentioning recently, that like if you boil down the demands from the Communist Manifesto, many of them were subsequently met, but in like partial or half ways, right? So there's a certain anachronism, perhaps, to this reference, but that's intentional. I don't think that the reference to the quote from Capital is our best bearing for Jameson's theory of freedom. I don't think that we're through this text enough to give your answer an adequate answer here.
Gotcha.
So I think we should spend more time with this book and come back to that question of what freedom might be for Jameson.
The reason I bring that up is I don't know. Have you guys read Walter Lippmann by any chance?
I have, yeah.
I don't know. He was Noam Chomsky kind of riffed on Lippmann when he wrote wrote his magnum opus. But anyway, point is, one of Lippmann's, I think, one of his points, one of his ideas that I think has a lot of value. It's not pleasant, but but I think it works to explain a lot of things. Is he rejects this. He doesn't use this language, but he rejects this idea of universal subjectivity. He rejects the idea of a single of what we might call the public, what we might even call the proletariat. He rejects this idea of any kind of universal collective identity, the possibility of it, right? And I used to hate that idea, but over the last 10 or 20 years, I actually think he's probably on the right track with that. And I've deep dive into Lippmann and Dewey and the Lippmann Dewey debate right now. So I've kind of got the stuff in the brain, but this idea of universal subjectivity it drives it sort of, for me, drives right at the heart of some differences in political philosophies, and that's why I brought it up.
Yeah, it's very interesting to read Walter Lippmann because his thought was formed in a polemic with American Marxists,
Yeah,
actually.
no, he discusses.
He's like a former Marxist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he is, and I, frankly, I mean, as someone who's kind of, spent years sort of studying Marxism in a very kind of relaxed way, Lippmann makes to me now, or Lippmann makes a lot of sense. He presents a very sort of dark picture of what you might call subjectivity or human nature, but I think it may be quite accurate and something that we can't reject. But I don't want to. This isn't a Lippmann seminar, so I don't want to go off on a tangent on that. But
No, thank you for that. I think a lot of people would know Chomsky's anti-Marxism if they recognized Walter Lippmann's anti-Marxism,
yeah,
which is often overlooked. Anyways,
yeah.
Philip, please. Thank you, John.
Okay, so I don't want to take us too far afield here, but there's an interesting kind of comparison that I have in mind. Several years back, I started, this is just continuing this question of subjectivity and freedom. Several years back, I had done a deep dive into Buddhism, and there's the um, very significant figure in popularizing Buddhism in the West is Bhikkhu Bodhi, and he was trained. He did, I believe, a PhD in philosophy, and a very significant article he wrote is called "Transcendental Dependent Origination," and what the reason why this came to mind in this discussion for me is because, when we were talking earlier about, this linear causality, in this paper, what Bhikkhu Bodhi is talking about is, basically reverse dependent origination. And what the import of it is it's essentially, desubjectivizing. Um, it's the subject taking this, using their qualified agency to effectively I guess you could call it like castrating themselves from being a subject of the world of, so you can think of it even beyond, um, our more familiar categories of economy, politics. It's very totalizing, uh, and I was approaching this um, where it very strongly clashed with Marxism, in that Marxism, uh, in its conception of emancipation, is all about, you have to go through history. You can't escape being a subject. And uh, I don't know if there's any interest in maybe taking a look at this, and anyone, I could put the link in. But the other thing I have in mind is, like, it's just an interesting foil for dealing with. I think we might need to like revisit the legacy of Spinoza's monism in Althusser, and how this plays out for Jameson's polemic. And another article that I can put in maybe the Discord or something is looking at uh, it's about, you know, how we can think of these different kinds of causalities, and how Spinoza is how he's responding to formal causation, and you know, what I found really interesting about the Christian discussion in this chapter was this metonymy between expressionism and emanationism. So those are just some things that we can maybe return to. You know, what the metonymy is playing a very big role in how this polemic is being developed, and you know, decoding when, like, okay, what is when we're using a signifier, you know, this is going back to this like hermeneutic of suspicion, right? Like, what is this? I think this is the maybe the more symptomatic instance of the absent cause. You know, okay, what is this? In this method, how do you decode what's going on when you know, we think, you know, we're speaking in code for what's the target and who's being implied.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. It's very interesting to see if Buddhist metaphysics would align with this third form of causality, of structural causality, as they possess a theory of the void, or they possess a theory of the absent cause. I don't know Buddhism well enough, but I suspect that there may be some resonance and crossover with that question. And of course, we never defined metonymy, but it refers to a system of pure differential relationality, and it's usually portrayed as a horizontal form of a signifying chain. And in Lacanian thought, there's a huge debate about if social phenomena are metonymic. How do we discern a unique signifier that coheres that metonymy? So you have a system of difference, but that system of difference is actually determined by a privileged interlocutor, a privileged signifier itself. So you have like these kind of like multiple layers of metonymic systems that are determined, and so they still have, even though internal to them they may appear as a system of pure difference. This is the big debate about of Ernesto Laclau and hegemony theory that's utilizing this conception. Sorry, Drew, please jump in.
Yeah, so I thought maybe I was thinking about some of the questions that were asked earlier about subjectivity, where does object and this stuff work? So like where I started was on page 9. So I think that the question is where is he starting from? Where does where does the subject emerge in the structure? So like it's very clear that he starts from the middle, right? He always says um, the act of interpretation and and presupposes as its organizational fiction that we really never confronted text immediately, in all its freshness as a thing in itself. Rather, texts come before us as they always already read. We apprehend them through sedimented layers of previous interpretations, or if the text is brand new, through sedimented reading habits and categories developed by those inherited interpretive traditions. So we're always starting from the middle. And so who's the subject? The subject is the reader. We already are a pre-given reader, but we're already an effect of of the process of history, which is on the side of the object, because history is a process without a subject. So I'll get there in a minute. So then on page 10, he says, um, you know, and he introduces this concept of the reader, right? Like he's like, and so for example, uh, uh, he's like, because of the peculiar focus of this retrospective organization, however, it may be worth warning the reader what the political conscious is not. The reader should not, in the first place, expect anything like the exploratory projection, da 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 da. So the reader is always the subject, but the readers are the effect already of a series of theoretical, literary debates. And so when he then gets to page 13, he says, interpretation is not an isolated act, but takes place within a Homeric battlefield on which a host of interpretive options are either openly or implicitly in conflict. So what you have here is basically the reader, which is Jameson, entering into the battlefield of interpretative work. There are multiple interpretative methods are available to him, and he is coming in as a partisan in that battle. Um, and then what's interesting here is that there's an uneasy struggle for priority between models and history, between theoretical speculation and textual analysis, in which the former seeks to transform the latter into many mere examples adduced to support his abstract propositions, while the latter insistently to imply that the theory itself is just so much methodological scaffolding which can readily be dismantled once the serious business of practical criticism is underway. So the question really is, what is the reader trying to do in this given battle? So, and then he says, Marxism, a form of dialectic, which actually sort of cuts through this, which is through a primacy of theory, which is at one and the same time a recognition of the primacy of history itself. It's this kind of recursive relationship between the two that gives Marxism its particular upside for him. And he says here on page 19, my position here is that only Marxism offers a philosophically coherent and ideologically compelling resolution to the dilemma of historicism evoked above. Only Marxism can give us an adequate account of the essential mystery of the cultural past. And to deliver its and this is by reenacting the human adventure without falling into the hobbies of antiquarianism or the projections of the modernists. That's what Marxism is able to do. It's able to cut through these two positions. And what it's able to then do is that we can glimpse the vital claims upon us of such long dead issues as the seasonal alternation of the economy of a primitive tribe, the passionate disputes about the nature of the Trinity, the conflicting models of the polis on these polemics and of these texts. So that's what's unique about Marxism. Now, when he goes a bit further, is I'm going to move to page 29. He says this kind of allegorical, so then he's really dealing with this problem of expressive causality. How do you deal with narrative? Because if you're already in interpretations and all you're doing is a battle of interpretations, then you're basically in a argument about narrations. And I think that one of the earlier speakers spoke about how the Bible always speaks to us. His grandmother used to say that. But the problem is the Bible doesn't speak to us. The Bible is not written for us, right? Like, there's a great, I don't know if any of you guys spend a lot of time on TikTok, but there's a guy called Dan McClellan. Has anyone seen him on TikTok? He's a biblical scholar who has made a huge following.
I watch him on YouTube. I can't stand TikTok, but
Yeah,
I like him. I think he's pretty good.
that's brilliant. And what Dan will always remind you is that Paul thinks that by the time within a generation of the Bible, he thinks everyone will be in the rapture. Like they're literally talking to a historical grouping who are completely unlike us. They have a completely different worldview. So then the problem for him becomes, well, if that's the case, then how do we have histories, right? Because then he says to himself, the problem becomes is that you then have codings, which are people that, anyways, I'm not going to actually go down to coding, but what he's trying to say is that the problem we have with history is that we all have fractions of history, but also all we have is our own histories as narrative, but those are cut off from previous groups and their narrative histories. So your narrative history, even as a Christian in the 21st century, is going to be dramatically different as a historical retelling than someone who was living in the first century AD and their historical retelling and presence in relation to the Christology. Okay. Yeah. So what he then says is to get out of this problem is that. Sorry, just one second. I'm just finding it. He says, I'm going to take history from the side of the object. Uh, Sorry, just give me 1 second. I'm trying to find the page. Oh, yeah, here it is. Page 34. The conception of the political unconscious outlined in this book is an attempt to cut through this particular dilemma by relocating it within the object. Because by doing that, by putting in the object, you're then in the history without a process. You're no longer in a world of narrative closures and of characters, of subjective history. So what you then can do then is by putting it on that side, putting it through as a process, then what you can then do is we can then, as a subject, we can we can both see them as within our laws of history, and then we can the idea in this because then the idea is, in other words, that if interpretation in terms of expressive causality or of allegorical master narratives remains a constant temptation, that is because such master narratives have inscribed themselves in the text as well as in our thinking about them. Such an allegorical narrative signifies our persistent dimension of literary and cultural text precisely because they reflect a fundamental dimension of our collective thinking and our collective fantasies about history and reality. So by pushing history as an object into the objective side, we can understand history as a process while remaining on the subjective side as interpreters and readers.
Well,
And
that's
then being
very well
able to,
said.
and so then you were able to look at multiple different interpretive narratives
Yeah,
and histories simultaneously, and then parse them, and then
I
engage in a battlefield.
I think that's right, but I'm also curious about uh, the conception that expressive causality puts forward, which Jameson is ambivalent about embracing regarding things like a worldview of a class or a master narrative of a social form of truth. All of that is put under suspicion in a certain way, but not it's not rejected. So he has that subtlety where he's sort of not wanting to reject. He's leaning towards all through structural causality for sure, but he's trying to modify the middle one, expressive causality, while not rejecting it entirely.
Yeah, I don't think he's trying to. Well, I mean, I don't think he's trying to abandon expressive causality, but I think he's trying to say is that I think that he would be reluctant to give Marxism a completely an escape from it being a master narrative or another interpretive schema like other interpretive schemas. Rather, he has to admit to that and then say what are the merits of that interpretive procedure, right? So that's why he's saying earlier the upshot of Marxism is that it actually can give you insights into cultural production in a way that, for example, he says on page 17, he openly admits that he says, for example, traditional literary history has, of course, never prohibited the investigation of such topics as the Florentine political background in Dante or Milton's relationship to schismatics.
Mm.
However, he says, I would argue, however, that such information, even where it is not be contained, as it is in most instances, by an idealistic conception of the history of ideas, does not yield interpretations as such, but rather at its best is indispensable preconditions. So it's not that what Marxism is doing, which is its upside, is that the way that it's combining these kind of narrative, or these kind of elements which make interpretation possible.
Hmm.
That's the upshot of Marxism. It's not that Marxism has somehow escaped outside of interpretation or narration or any of those things. Rather, it's that it has a particular series of merits that make it better than other models.
Yeah.
Otherwise, then you don't have to have a philosophical battlefield. It's then you get to yell on the like. It's like we did, at least I did as a young man. You're wrong. I'm right because I'm a Marxist. No, no, you have
Right.
to actually give an upshot of that analysis.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Thank you for that intervention. And I know it is getting late, but we'll save the best for last and have Connor jump in for final comment. Greetings, comrade. How are you?
I'm good. I'm sorry I'm late. I got some things to do, but turn up the political unconscious, a big one. I'm hyped. Yeah. So a couple of things I wanted to touch on. Uh I'm glad Akshay put it in the chat, that classic electric footnote from Marx, this realm of necessity and realm of freedom stuff. I just wanted to harp on that for one more second, because it's really important to affirm that there is no realm of freedom right now. It does not exist. And that's really important to point out because the reified mind capitulating to a local situation out of necessity uh, can tell itself, because it is unable to explain problems properly, that there is a realm of freedom already happening, right? The inability to address those problems can appear as though they're unproblematic, and thus there is a realm of freedom already happening. That's ideology, right? That's ideology. Um, and what we are saying as Marxists is that you guys are not talking about this problem because you're unable to recognize it as a problem, but we can because we're Marxists. So getting back to something Drew just said, we are right because we are Marxists. And it's a polemical point that I like to really harp on because this book is very polemical at times. You know, like that sort of critique that I just leveled, that there is no realm of freedom, yet people try to convince themselves that there are. You know, what we're talking about is just like liberal ideology, you know, this sort of like tendency to do that. Also, Drew mentioned that the Bible doesn't speak to us. I think it does. Like, and by that I mean, still on page 19, this mystery can be reenacted only if the human adventure is one. Only thus, and not through the hobbies of antiquarianism or the projections of the modernists, can we glimpse the vital claims upon us. And I really like that moment because literary criticism is not something that we go to and make speak. It acts on us, right? History, or the repression of history, is alive, right? It's less a question of does the Bible speak? It does speak to us. We have to be able to listen. You know, we have to learn to recover and make that voice, you know, really articulate itself. That's part of what we're doing. And you know, it's really helpful to just like go over some basic stuff. You know, what this book is really uh let's say takes as a conceit, that theory is class struggle, right? why are we doing ideology critique? Why are we critiquing theory, right? Because it is a weapon of class domination, right? That's what we're talking about. And yeah, and thus it needs to be explained why Marxist theory is correct and the true science, etc. With all that being said, I just want to like return to the preface to sort of like clarify what this book is and like isn't. Um, in the area of culture, which is the central field of the present book, we are thus confronted with a choice between study of the nature of the objective structures of a given cultural text and something rather different, which would instead foreground the interpretive categories or codes through which we read and receive the text in question. This presupposition then dictates the use of a method according to which our object of study is less the text itself than the interpretations through which we attempt to confront and to interpret. What we're critiquing is the interpretive apparatus that people are using. What we're critiquing is the emergence of theoretical fields and how they're operating, why they're using concepts, and how those apparatuses repress history. And in repressing history, serve who and what? You know, that's what we're talking about. So, and it just reminds me too, you know, like one of the big ideas here is that we're trying to historicize concepts. There's history within concepts that cannot be heard, to revoke this earlier theme, right? And yeah, I guess I'll just end in saying that, like, although this is such a prestigious like book, and people often say that Jameson is incredibly influential and this book is incredibly influential, I'm not sure what they mean when they say that. Because it's sort of like accepted wisdom to, you know, take this book seriously. But I say I'm not sure what they mean when they say that because the demands that Jameson is making on us as critics are enormous. And how then do we like properly use a Jamesonian method of cultural criticism? I don't see a lot of people doing it, frankly. You know, they'll pick up insights from Jameson, but I don't see a lot of semiotic squares in scholarship right now. You know what I mean? So, what does it mean to do criticism according to Jameson? How do we do that? You know, and that's something obviously we're gonna learn more about. But what that was my little rant. So,
So I think that what I was trying to say is that when I say the Bible doesn't speak to us, is that the Bible speaks to us through multiple interpretive traditions. So whether it's the Catholic tradition or various Baptist traditions or whatever may be the case of the United States. However, it doesn't speak to us as he's saying, in this kind of first time I've ever read you. You're always reading it through an interpretive lens and you're engaging with that sense. And what I'm trying to say is that if you think about the time in which this book, the Bible, was written, its interpretive framework would have been radically different. So you're talking about late Judaism of the first century AD, and then you have the congealment of those texts over the next 300 to 400 years, and that's the beginnings of what we would call the making of the modern Bible, right? Whereas when we're reading it, we're reading it 2,000 years afterwards with all sorts of interpretive frameworks having come between us and the text, which we're always engaging with. Now, I think that the other thing I was struck by what you were saying, Connor, was whether people are using Gramscian squares and stuff like that. I mean, I think that yes, some of those very particular methodological approaches are out of vogue, right? I think this book reflects a very particular period of time in which it was written, right? Like, so he's citing Gramsci's books, like like his articles from the 70s, which hadn't been translated yet. So this book, in that way, is a kind of a condensation of a period of intensity of theoretical production he was engaged in. But also, I think what's interesting for me as someone who comes from the Althusserian milieu is that it's not um, two of the major Althusserian literary works, right? So Macheret makes nearly no presence in this book. So that's one tradition. And then Pushoian French discourse analysis doesn't make an appearance at all in this book. And so, in some sense, like this is, I think that it's useful to think of Jameson as a variant, as another, like along with rethinking Marxism, you have rethinking Marxism coming out of one tradition, and then you have the MLG group and the Marxist literary group as another kind of post-Althusserian tradition, which is sort of influenced by. And I would say that that's where Connor, I mean, some of the people like my friend Tom Laughlin, who gave me my copy, would definitely see himself as writing within a very Jamesonian style of writing. And I would say the people sort of clustered around MLG have done some of that work. But I think that that's what I thought was interesting was that this is not Basharian. He chooses to, and he makes much later on just one or two references to Macheret and how he's methodologically different. But I think that what makes it different, and I think that I was also interested in what you were saying about, uh, because he's very clear that he's not engaged in ideological analysis, right? So, like I think several times people have brought up ideology, but he's very clear he's not doing ideological analysis. He says here on page 12. Um, It is at least possible that the present work might be taken as an outline or projection of a new kind of critical method. Indeed, it would seem to me perfectly appropriate to recast many of its findings in the form of a methodological handbook, but such a manual would have its object ideological analysis, which remains, I believe, the appropriate designation for the critical method specific to Marxism. So he's doing something else here, which is not Marxist ideological criticism. He's not Slavoj. He's not trying to do that kind of cultural work. He's doing something else. And I think that that's what's really interesting is that,
Like I kind of see the major thrust of the reading that we did for today is, we ended on page 33, I think. Jameson says, wait a minute, what we're doing is really weird because we're using Althusser to um and Althusser is trying to say that there's no master narratives, right? But of course what we're trying to do is affirm Marxism as the master narrative. So how could it be that the critique of master narratives
but
produces an
I don't
affirmation
think, I don't think, but I don't think,
of the
but I
master
don't,
narrative of
but I don't think,
Marxism?
but I don't
Another way
think
of
that,
saying the same thing, what is it about Althusser's method that illuminates something in Marxism? How do we incorporate that method into what is a recovery of the legitimation of the Marxist method of analysis? That's kind of the move that's being made in what we read for
I
today.
don't, I think we see the move slightly differently because I think the move there is not that he's trying to say the Marxism is the master narrative. I think that he's trying to argue that there's an upside to Marxist analysis of cultural production, which connects history and the present, which is not contained in other methodological schools. So, and I think what he's saying is that going through Althusser, and this is a book of its time, so it's always worth remembering. Like this is the same time that Kristeva and all of them are all having their Althusserian, like not Kristeva, sorry, like people like Elizabeth Gross and all of these guys in Australia. Everyone's having their Althusserian moment from approximately 74 to about 78, 79, because that's when it comes out in English. So I think that he's working through Althusser because I think that he's seeing in Althusser and he says here, like, what I really like about Althusser is that Althusser forces me to think about how do we produce concepts. And so I think that what he's trying to find in Althusser, what he likes about Althusser is a challenge to his historicism. And so what he's trying to do, because what that does for him is that it allows him to produce a historicism that evades all of the critiques of anti-historicism. And that's where he's really intrigued by process without a subject. That's where he's really appeals to all of these concepts because these are ways for him to avoid the very critiques of a naive historicism, which he sees around him amongst other literary theorists, especially history of ideas folks.
Brilliant. I think for purpose of time, we're going to close everyone, but this has been a fabulous first session. So again, 45 pages a week, give or take. And at that rate, we will kind of conclude by July 1st, meeting every Tuesday night. I think along the way, please do join the Discord because a lot of supplemental readings are, I think, necessary. Familiarity. As we go, if folks have expertise or background in some of the thinkers and writers that are mentioned, reach out to me and you can make a presentation. That would be amazing. Anyways, thanks everyone. Been great. See you Tuesday. Good night.
Thank you. Right on.
See you.